So for today, I believe God has guided me to speak about the subject of backsliding. And I want to talk about how Jesus can restore us when we backslide. And talk about how do we stop backsliding and how do we draw closer to Christ. I believe God wants us to be encouraged that even when you do backslide, He doesn't turn His back on you, but instead in His mercy and in His love, He reaches out to you and He offers a fresh start and He restores you. And that's what He did in the life of Peter. And that's the passage that we're going to read this morning to start off. We know Peter was a follower of Jesus, and he was passionate, he was true, he meant it when he followed Christ. But we know he backslid. We know he denied Christ, and we know he denied Him 3 times. And the passage that we're going to read now is reflective of what happened after that. We know obviously that Jesus rose from the dead after He was crucified. He rose from the dead, but Peter, who went back to his fishing, he had no idea that Jesus is back from the dead. And so the passage we're going to read, is an account of how Jesus met with Peter right after Peter backslid and went back to his old life. So let's read that passage. Turn our Bibles to John chapter 21, the Gospel of John, chapter 21. And we're going to read from verse 1 to 14. The entire chapter, is about how Jesus restores Peter, but we're going to just stick to verse 1 to 14. John chapter 21, verse 1 to 14. Let me read that for you. Jesus later appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee, and this is how it happened. Several of the disciples were there: Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples. And Simon Peter said, "I'm going fishing." They all said, "We will come too." So they went out in the boat, but they caught nothing all night. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who He was. He called out, "Friends, have you caught any fish?" "No," they replied. Then He said, "Throw out your net on the right side of the boat and you will get some." So they did. And they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Then the disciple Jesus loved, that's John, said to Peter, "It's the Lord." And when Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, he jumped into the water, and he swam to the shore. The others stayed with the boat and pulled the net to the shore. And when they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them: fish cooking over a charcoal fire and some bread. And Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to the shore. There were 153 large fish, and yet the net hadn't torn. "Now come and have some breakfast," Jesus said. None of the disciples dared to ask Him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Then Jesus served them bread and fish. And this was the 3rd time Jesus had appeared to His disciples since He had been raised from the dead. We will stop there. So we see Jesus is having an encounter with Peter, and we see that this passage we read, puts focus on Peter. And we also, when we read the subsequent verses, we see Jesus interacting with Peter. But before we go into the passage and talk about what happened to Peter and how he backslid, I just want to first share a few things about backsliding. And I want to share a few things that the Bible actually shows us about backsliding and what it means and how it happens in our lives. So the first thing I want to say is that backsliding is moving away from Jesus. Backsliding is moving away from Jesus. I actually looked up the Cambridge Dictionary just to see how it defines backsliding, and it says, "It is to go back to doing something bad when you have been doing something good." And it also says, it's failing to do something that you had agreed to do. And then right below that meaning, that description, there was an example. You know how dictionaries have examples to show how the word is used. And quite interestingly, this was the example. Somebody says, My diet was going well, but I've been backsliding a lot recently. You know. So I thought that's a good example, and it's also my personal testimony, as I thought I'll share. Since it's backsliding, I want to testify to that. So we get the idea. Backsliding, as it's defined even in the dictionary, it's to regress. It is to lose the progress you've made. It conveys the idea of returning to a harmful path or to a negative direction. It is slipping away from the right direction. It could be reverting to previous behaviors which are wrong and harmful to you. In simple words, it's going back to what you've left behind. Now, when it comes to the Christian life, when we say backsliding, we are talking about moving away from Jesus. We're talking about drifting away from Jesus. And we're talking about growing apart from Jesus. And to not be in touch with Jesus anymore. To be out of touch with Jesus. So that's a backslider in the Christian life. Somebody who gets out of touch with the Lord. Somebody who was once devoted to Jesus, but later on something happened and the person began to take their relationship with Christ less seriously. And a backslider is also in a state of misery. You know why? Because they can't fully enjoy the Lord because they've grown apart from the Lord. They also can't fully enjoy the world in a sense because they know they need the Lord. So it's a state of misery. That's a backslider. And second, backsliding is not always visible and obvious. We need to understand not all backsliding will be visible externally. Because sometimes we might make the mistake of thinking of somebody who has abandoned God, who speaks against God, somebody who's turned his back on God, left the faith. And it's a mistake to think of someone like that when we think of backsliding. That's not the only form of backsliding. Backsliding can also happen in a way that it's not visible externally. It's not immediately noticeable on the outside. It might not look obvious. I remember this month, I had a couple of back-to-back trips, and so I couldn't go to the gym, so I missed going to the gym for like 2 weeks, and then I was back there. And then my trainer, saw me, and the first thing he did, he just looked at me, he just scanned me top to bottom from, head to toe. He said, "Looks like you've not been working out at all." And I just didn't know what to say. But I think of that because he just looked at me, and he said, he's implying it really shows, you've not been working out. I can really tell, I can really see the signs. I can visibly see the fact that you've not been working out. But, backsliding may not look that way. It won't be so obvious on the outside necessarily. Right? It won't be visible on the outside necessarily. Because backsliding can also happen in our inner life with Christ. On the outside, we might be able to do the things that a Christian would do. The regular daily things, the Sunday things that a Christian would do. But backsliding may not be visible on the outside, but it's really present in the inner life with God, with Christ sometimes. And your spiritual appearance doesn't necessarily reflect your spiritual authenticity. It's possible to be in the church physically, but to not be part of the church spiritually. So you could be doing all the things that a Christian should do and still be distant from Christ and still not love Christ and follow Christ. And we all know the story of prodigal son, right? And when we think of backsliding, that's one of the examples, one of the stories we know from the Bible. This father with 2 sons, and then the younger son left home, and he squandered his life, he squandered the wealth. And then finally, he came to himself and he realized, I need my father, and I need to go back to my father's house. So he repents, he goes back, and the father receives him. Great story, right? But the story doesn't end there, because the story also talks about his elder brother who has been in the house, who has been doing all the right things, who's been with the father, taking care of the business and taking care of the father, who's been doing all the right things. But then it ends by saying, it shows that the elder brother was unhappy, that his brother came home. And it shows that he didn't have the right attitude towards his younger brother, and he didn't have the right attitude even towards the father. So when we think of backsliding, we often think of the prodigal son, right? But in the story, we actually see there is somebody else who has backslidden as well. And it's the elder brother who on the outside looks fine. On the outside, is a perfect Christian, but in the inner life, he's not right with the father and he's not right with his brother. So we need to realize God looks at the inner life, not the outward life. And that's where we need to get right with God. And that's where backsliding happens, in our lives. The third thing I want to say is backsliding can be self-identified. You can actually identify backsliding in yourself. You just have to take a look at yourself and you just have to know what that looks like. Backsliding can be self-identified by noticing the signs, and the symptoms. We all know when we go to the doctor, what's one of the first questions they ask? What are the symptoms, right? What are the signs? And we obviously tell the doctor, all the symptoms, and the doctor would use those symptoms, to understand what the problem is, to identify the problem, and then prescribe the medicine for the problem. So, that signs will, the symptoms will help us identify the problem, right? Except when you Google, your symptoms, that's when you never get it right. And sometimes it's like way too scary. Never Google your symptoms. It's always cancer for some reason. It's always cancer. It's like, I have toothache, pancreatic cancer. That's the answer. That's what you get from Google. But it's true that symptoms help us identify the problem so that we can deal with the problem. Now, in the same way, when it comes to backsliding, there are signs, there are symptoms, that when we look at, we can identify. But we know it's between you and God. But let me share some of the signs of backsliding. Decrease in prayer life. A decrease in your hunger for God's word. Losing the joy of your salvation. Making less room for God and more room for other things. Tolerating sin in your life. Losing your Christian convictions and values. Becoming indifferent to sharing the gospel. Becoming indifferent to the lost, to the world around us. Neglecting church. Decrease in generosity. Your love growing cold towards Jesus. Losing your first love that you had for Jesus. Not being intentional about pursuing God. You see, these are some of the signs, I just wanted to slowly take you through them. Some of the signs, which when they are happening in our lives, we can say for sure, I think there is some backsliding at some level that's happening in my life. Because the truth is, when it comes to backsliding in the Christian life, you are either moving forward or you're going backward. You are either progressing or you're regressing. There is no in between. I know that if I'm not progressing, if I'm not growing, then I'm also growing backwards. I'm moving backwards. I'm regressing. So we can identify backsliding in our inner life based on, how our relationship with God is presently going. And we can know, by some of these signs that I shared, that there is some kind of backsliding that's happening. The next, backsliding often starts with pride. Very important point. It often starts with pride. And Peter, the passage that we read, Peter is a good example of someone who backslid but still found his way. But how did it start? It started with pride. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 33. Can you turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 26, verse 23. Let's read that verse. Matthew 26, verse 33. Peter answered and said to Jesus, "Even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away." So you see, this verse actually shows that, Peter is telling Jesus, he's very confident that he's not going to fall away, when persecution comes. And we see that Peter is also comparing himself with others, because he says, even though They might fall away, and all of them might fall away, but I will never fall away. See, we see in this verse, Peter saw himself as spiritually more advanced than others. He saw himself as somebody who was spiritually superior to others, over the other disciples. And, maybe he regarded himself as having a higher spiritual standing, spiritual strength. And he felt like he had a unique spiritual edge, over the other followers. And that's why he said, even if they all fall away, Lord, I will not fall away. Right? And we see pride. And we see that this is a statement of pride. And pride manifests in many different ways, but one of the evidences of pride is actually prayerlessness. Prayerlessness. Lack of prayer is an evidence of pride. We know Peter, who said this, he went on to sleep when Jesus asked him to pray. And Jesus said, could you not, pray just for 1 hour? And we see one of the manifestations of pride is lack of prayer, because prayer by definition is dependence on God. And so when we don't pray, we are acting as if we don't have to depend on God, right? So somebody who knows how much they need God is going to pray. And that's why pride shows itself in prayerlessness. And Peter's pride led to prayerlessness, and that led to his failure. And that led him to deny Jesus. And that's what we see happen next. He betrayed Jesus in Mark chapter 14, 66 to 68. It says, Peter was in the courtyard, and one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she said, you were also with Jesus. But then it says he denied it. He's saying, I neither know nor understand what you're talking about. And then in Matthew 26, verse 74, Peter, it says, he began to curse and swear that he doesn't know Jesus. He's not just saying he doesn't know Jesus, he begins to curse and he begins to swear, because that's how seriously he wants to convince, the people that he doesn't know Jesus. He has nothing to do with Jesus. And then we know a rooster crowed and Jesus saw him. So we see backsliding starts with pride quite often. And next, backsliding eventually leads to deep regret and sorrow. Any kind of backsliding that happens in our lives, when we don't return to Christ, there's only one way it's going to end. It's going to end in deep regret and sorrow. In Luke chapter 22, verse 62, about Peter, after he denied, it says he went outside and he wept. And it says he wept bitterly. Why? Because he felt the guilt of denying the Son of God who loves him unconditionally. And the guilt was so unbearable, and the guilt was suffocating him, and he could feel this unbearable heaviness that he denied the one who loves him the most. And he's walked with Jesus. He's seen the miracles. He knows who he is. He was convinced that Jesus is the Son of God. And in fact, Peter once said, Lord, to whom else can we go? But after he denied him, he wept bitterly. Backsliding, in many ways, it eventually leads to deep regret and deep sorrow because of growing apart from Jesus. And at the end of the tunnel of backsliding, there's only misery and sorrow. Because the truth is, you gain nothing by losing Jesus. Because Jesus defines everything. When you have Jesus, you have everything, because he is everything. And so you gain nothing by losing Jesus. But that's what happened to Peter. He lost Jesus. He denied Jesus, and he gained nothing except misery and sorrow and deep regret. And that's why it says he wept bitterly. And that's what's waiting for anyone at the end of life. If the person doesn't return, and if the person continues to backslide, it always ends with deep regret and misery, because Jesus is the only source of joy and life and happiness. So that's one. It's also true, backsliding doesn't change Christ's love for us. This is how we begin to overcome backsliding. Backsliding doesn't change Christ's love for us. I came across this very interesting story. We all know the song, the hymn, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. We all know that hymn, and we've sung it many times. But you know who wrote it? Somebody called Robert Robinson. He authored the hymn. And he's got a very interesting story. He was passionate for God, and, he wrote this hymn out of his joy and love for God. And, he was enjoying his relationship with Jesus. But then slowly, somewhere down the line, he began to backslide, and he wandered away, from Jesus. And he started giving himself, to a sinful lifestyle, and he just left God, and he drifted away from Jesus. And one day, hoping to just relieve his mind, he decided to travel. And as he was traveling, he met a young Christian woman, and they were just having a conversation, and she just brought up this hymn that he had written. And she said, there's this hymn that I heard recently, and it's a beautiful hymn, and it's called Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. Have you heard it? And he tried to, evade the conversation. He didn't want to admit that he was the one who authored it. He tried to evade it. But she pressed on. And then eventually, with tears streaming down his face, he said, well, actually, I'm the man who wrote that hymn many years ago. And he said, I would give anything to experience that joy once again. I would give anything to feel that joy that I once knew. And she was greatly surprised. And she said, I actually want to point you to the words, the very words from your own psalm. And she read the second line of the psalm. And she said, streams of mercy never ceasing. And she said, those streams of mercy are still flowing, and they will never cease. And Mr. Robinson was deeply moved, and he turned his heart back to Christ. See, his own song led him back to Jesus, right? And Jesus used the very song that he wrote to remind him that his streams of mercy, his streams of joy and love are still flowing, and they never cease. So this is the turning point, in our backsliding. Even when we backslide, it doesn't change his love for us. That's why in the passage that we read, if you can go back to John chapter 21, it begins by saying, Jesus appeared. Jesus appeared. I could try and preach a whole sermon with just those two words. Jesus appeared. And why is that so significant? Because Jesus is showing up for the friends who betrayed him, right? He's showing up for Peter, who turned his back on him. It says Jesus appeared. John 21 verse 1. Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. So how do we stop backsliding? We know it never ends well, and we know it takes away the joy of our salvation. And we know we don't want to be backsliding. We know we want to walk with the Lord. So how do we stop backsliding, and how do we draw closer to Christ? Well, the first thing, we have to respond to the love of Christ. We have to respond to the love of Christ. So let's go into the chapter once again. John chapter 21 verse 3. Verse 3, it says, Simon Peter told them, I'm going out to fish. I'm going out to fish. That's actually a very sad statement. Verse 3 that you just read, he's saying, I'm going out to fish. You know why it's sad? Because Peter was somebody who followed Jesus. Peter was somebody who met with Jesus, who saw the signs, miracles, who was following Jesus everywhere. And he was in the ministry alongside Jesus. But now that he denied Jesus, and now that he doesn't also know Jesus has risen from the dead, he says, I'm going out to fish. He's going back to his old profession. But we also know it's sad because Peter wept bitterly, and there is one question that's haunting Peter probably. And the question is, what can I do when I have failed, the most faithful friend? What can I do? And that's probably a question he's trying to escape. That's a question he's trying to run away from. He just wants to escape, maybe the reality of the fact that he denied Jesus, because that haunts him, and he just wants an escape. And he says, I'm just going out to fish. And he doesn't want to relive that pain anymore. So maybe he turns to fishing, not just because it was his old profession, but because he wants a mindless diversion. He just wants to not think of what he did to Jesus. And so he goes out to fish, but the sea is not very helpful. Right? He doesn't catch anything. It says they caught nothing. And as Peter is in the boat, maybe, I don't know, I just imagine, the waves are, against the boat, and he's just in the boat and he's trying to catch fish, and, but he's not able to catch any. And maybe as he's in the boat, maybe he remembers his times with Jesus. Even though he's trying to escape, the pain of what he did to Jesus, maybe it keeps coming back to his mind because he remembers, he was once in the boat with Jesus, and Jesus calmed the storm. And once he walked with Jesus, on the water. But all that seemed to be a distant memory, right? It's just memories now. And so he's just in the boat. And then all of a sudden, as we read in the passage, there's a voice that he hears. There's a voice he hears. In verse 5, the voice says, "Friends, caught any fish?" Jesus he's actually asking a question that's not meant to be answered. Jesus is saying, "Friends, you haven't caught any fish, have you?" That's the kind of question he's asking. And so that's the voice they hear. And so they try to, see, Peter also sees, but they're not able to recognize, who this person is. And it's just a voice. And then in verse 6, the voice again says, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some fish." And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. See, that's a miracle. Now we read this story and we see it in a very ordinary way and we see it as a miracle. But this was very personal to Peter. This was very personal to Peter because when that miracle happened, Jesus said, "Throw your net on the right side." I think it's the right side. Throw your net on the right side. And when they catch fish, Peter sees that it's a miracle. And what happens to Peter perhaps? His memory is jolted because he remembers that Jesus had performed this very same miracle. And so, his memory is jolted back to Jesus. And we see that, they are amazed that they've caught so much of fish. And maybe, Peter's mind goes back to the time when, Jesus borrowed his boat and preached from the boat. And then, Jesus asked him to follow, him. And how Peter fell down, on the ground. And he said, "Lord, I'm too much of a sinner to be in your presence. I'm not worthy to be in your presence." But Jesus still said, "Follow me, because you're going to be fishers of men." And so Peter's memory is probably going back to, those miracles that Jesus did. And what's amazing is that Jesus, in his love, it's as though he's recreating, that entire scene. It's as if he's recreating that miracle for Peter. Perhaps to remind Peter, of the miracle, the same miracle that he did. And then in verse 7, it says, "The disciple whom Jesus loved, which is John, said to Peter, 'It's the Lord. It's the Lord.' And as soon as Peter heard him say, 'It's the Lord,' that's all he needed to hear. He just wrapped his outer garment and he jumped into the water and he began to swim to the shore. Because Peter couldn't contain himself. So he dives into the water and he swims maybe about 100 yards to the shore. And he's wet, he's shivering, but perhaps not from the cold, but more from the emotional weight and expectation of seeing the Lord, whom he had denied. And then when he reaches the shore, the first thing he sees, is the fire and the charcoal, the fish and the bread. He sees a breakfast is being prepared, and it's being prepared by Jesus. And Jesus stands there, and Peter probably doesn't have any words because we don't see what Peter said. Maybe, he struggles with his words. He doesn't know what to say. And then Jesus says, "Have breakfast. Come and have breakfast." And Jesus says, "Bring your fish. Bring your fish. Bring all that you caught." And so they go and they bring the fish. And they have a nice breakfast. And Jesus makes that breakfast for them. And so we don't see them having a conversation about the denial. No? We don't see Jesus and Peter talking about, what happened, what Peter did. And that's why it's so remarkable that Jesus did not bring it up. What's the first thing that you and I would have said to Peter if we saw him and if he denied us? "How could you do this to me? How dare you betray me? How dare you deny me?" But we don't see Jesus asking that question. He simply makes a breakfast for Peter. In verse 10, that's why Jesus says, bring some fish. So Jesus doesn't bring up the denial. And you keep reading chapter 21. Jesus asks 3 questions to Peter. After the breakfast, Jesus maybe takes Peter aside and he asks 3 questions. Peter, do you love me? 3 times. But I don't think he asked the question to shame Peter or to accuse Peter, but to give Peter the opportunity to affirm his love for Jesus. Because every time Peter said, yes, Lord, I love you. You know I love you. So Jesus is not inflicting pain by asking, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? But through the series of questions, he's healing Peter's wounds. And he's giving Peter a chance to reaffirm his love. And Jesus knows the tears of repentance. Because Jesus knows that Peter wept bitterly. And that was good enough for Jesus. Right? Jesus saw the repentance in Peter's heart. And so in a very gentle yet firm tone, he tells Peter, okay, now that you love me, now that you've affirmed your love for me, feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. Now it still seems a bit unrelated. Why would Jesus suddenly talk about feed my sheep? And we know sheep refers to the church. And Peter was one of the first leaders of the church. And Jesus is saying, okay, you love me, feed my sheep. What is Jesus trying to say? He's trying to tell Peter, Peter, I still believe in you. Even though you denied me, my offer still stands. I still have the call, that I placed upon you when I met you. I still want you to be a fisher of men. I still want you to lead the church and to feed the church. And so Jesus is saying, my call for you still stands. My offer still stands. He's saying, you're still the right person for the job, even though you denied me. And so with that, Jesus somehow, he completes Peter's restoration. And maybe, Peter's painful memory is, it's healed. And we know that Jesus, orchestrated this entire scene. That's how it appears. He orchestrated this whole thing to restore Peter among the other disciples as well. So we see Jesus did not bring up the painful memory to condemn Peter, but to restore him. And Jesus' goal was not to make Peter feel ashamed, but to make Peter feel loved and to make him feel still equipped for the job. So what do we see here? When we see this whole narrative, this picture of how Jesus approaches Peter and restores him, what do we see? We simply see the pure and true love of Christ. And we see that it's a very personal love, right? We see in the miracle that Jesus performed, it's a very personal love. It's a very unique love. And he loves Peter, and he loves Peter in a way that he doesn't love anyone else. His love for Peter is unique. And the same way, his love for you is unique. Because the way he loves you, he doesn't love anyone else. Because his love is unique for each one. It's his pure, true, and unique love. So it's love that restored Peter. It's the love of Christ that restored him. And it's the love of Christ that can restore you and me. So the question that's before us, is will you respond to his love? That's the question. How do we stop backsliding? We respond to his love. We see his love, and we see how unique and personal his love is for each one of us, and we respond to that. The second thing is also, we need to determine to obey Christ. We have to make a decision once again to obey Christ. You remember when Jesus said, throw your nets, on the other side and you will catch some fish. Even though they didn't know it was Jesus, they still, put the nets out and they caught and they caught a lot of fish, and it was a big miracle. Even though they didn't know it was Jesus, they still obeyed that voice. And you know what we see there? We see there that, when they worked, they caught nothing, right? But when Jesus worked, it was full. And that's true of life as well. When we work, it's empty. But when God works, it's full. Okay? But when does God work? He works when we obey. God works when we obey. And when God works, it's full. So we have to determine and say, Lord, I'm deciding to obey you, one step at a time, one choice at a time, one decision at a time. That's how we find our way back to Jesus. And then the last thing I would say is, give your heart to Jesus once again. Give your heart to Jesus once again. Now again in verse 17, we know Jesus asked him, do you love me? 3 times, right? And every time Peter said, yes, Lord, I love you. And the 3rd time he said, Lord, you know all things, and you know that I love you. There's a huge difference between, Peter from before, who said, Lord, even if they all fall away, I will never fall, I will never fall away from you. I will still love you. There's a huge difference, between that and the Peter now who says, Lord, you know I love you. Peter is humbled. He's aware of the smallness, and the insignificance of his love. And Peter is aware that, the measure of love in his heart, is not significant. It's the measure of love that's in the heart of Christ that's significant. And so Peter is lost in the love of Christ. And Peter says, Lord, you know how much I love you. And Peter is saying, Lord, I love you, but I don't know how much I love you. And I know I don't love you enough. I don't love you the way I should. And so Peter is honest. He's humble. And he says, Lord, you know how much I love you. You know what Peter is doing? Peter is giving his heart to Jesus. And it's almost as if Peter is saying, Lord, even if, there's only very little love in my heart, I still give my heart to you. That's what Peter, is perhaps thinking. And that's what we have to learn to do as well. I don't know what's the measure of love you have in your heart for Jesus, but Jesus wants your heart just the way it is. Just the way it is. You say, Lord, there's not a lot of love in my heart towards you. I think it's a small measure of love, but I still want to give my heart to you. I want to give my heart the way it is to you. And whatever little you give to Jesus, right, whatever little love you got in your heart, whatever little you give to Jesus, He will make much of it. And He will multiply it. He will increase it. Right? Because that's what He does. And that's what happened to Peter. He gave his heart to Jesus. And what happened? Within a few weeks, Peter would preach the boldest sermon in Jerusalem, a place that's hostile to Jesus. And when he preached, what happened? 3,000 conversions. 3,000 people came to the Lord. And Peter would later stand, before the Sanhedrin, and he would boldly proclaim his faith in Jesus, and he would shake the foundations of the temple. And not only that, Peter, who was a coward, he went on to become a martyr for Christ. And history shows us he was crucified upside down. He said, don't crucify me, straight, because I don't want to be, crucified like my Lord. I'm not worthy to die like my Lord. I want to be crucified upside down. So we see a radical boldness. We see a radical transformation. But how did that happen? He gave his heart to Jesus. He gave his heart with the little love that he had, in his heart. He gave it to Jesus. And that's how Jesus restored him. He was restored by the love of Jesus. And so that's my conclusion this morning, that we all need to fight signs of backsliding we see in our lives. We have to end backsliding. When we see that there's backsliding, we have to end backsliding, or backsliding will end us. But we don't have the will or the ability. We don't have the measure of love it takes. But Jesus wants us to give our hearts to Him with whatever love there is in it, and Jesus will restore us. Right? So that's the good news this morning, that a backslider doesn't have to remain a backslider, because we know that the Lord is still the friend of the fallen. He's still a friend of the weak. He's still a friend to the wandering sheep. And He will still be a friend to every backsliding Peter, in this room this morning. And He will restore them, because that's who He is. So I don't know if I'm describing you this morning, maybe not, but the Lord is here today, I believe, for those who feel backslidden. Maybe you don't feel so close to the Lord today as you should be. Maybe the things of God are not so sweet to you like before. Maybe there's no burning love, for Him and His house. Maybe you don't sense a deep hunger for His word. But I believe this morning, just like Peter, if you've heard His love and if you've felt His nudge, if you felt his unique love for you, then just like Peter, I just want to encourage you to swim your way back to, Jesus the way Peter did, because he awaits you on the shore. Amen? All right, so let's pray. And